Continuing on with the energy theme, I thought we would answer the question, can the U.S. dominate energy? So I first became exposed to this at what's known as the Offshore Technology Conference, which is the largest technology conference for offshore industries in the world. It's held in Houston every year. And this year, Secretary Zinke came and he announced the goal that we want to expand beyond just energy independence. We want to go to energy dominance. So that really got me thinking, okay, can we really do it? So I thought I'd we're going to go ahead and take a look at where is our current energy coming from and where does it go once we produce it. We'll review the Trump administration's energy goals and strategy and what does it mean to dominate. I mean, that word has all kinds of meanings to it. We'll do a SWOT analysis. I'll go over on a slide what I feel are the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats for each of our to meet the goal of energy dominance. And then we'll actually answer the question, can we dominate energy by looking at each sector? Oil, gas, coal, oil, nuclear, and then the renewables, hydro, geothermal, biofuels, wind, and of course solar. So first of all, where do we get our energy from? So in terms of energy sources, these are the sources that are out there, and just as Howard mentioned earlier, the EIA is an absolutely fabulous resource for energy information, and it's fascinating just to go in and plunk around on that website. There's an awful lot of things in there that give you some interesting things to think about. So first off, oil. We actually import, this is in quads now, quadrillion BTUs. I'm going back to the ridiculous units that Howard went over in his prior presentation. So that's the amount of oil that we import, and this is the amount of oil that we produce. And that surprised me, because I thought we were doing much better than this. I gave a presentation last year that showed our imports were shrinking. And I was correct, but I'll tell you why I was correct in a minute. That's what we get from natural gas. There's coal. There's nuclear, mainly hydro, some geothermal. Wood waste, we do still, unfortunately, cut down an awful lot of our hardwoods, especially in the bottomlands areas of South Carolina, and we export wood pellets. So we're generating energy from wood waste. Biofuels, wind, and as Howard just went over, solar. Solar, it's just minimal when you look at it in consistent energy units across all of it. Together as a society, we go through 111 quadrillion BTUs of energy every year. 83.3%, I'm a little more precise, yes, this is a presentation from an engineer, okay. 83.3% in last year in 16 came from hydrocarbons. And I noticed on Howard's slide he had 82, but that was in 2012. So if both of our numbers are correct, and I assume that we are, then we're actually seeing an increasing reliance on a percentage basis from hydrocarbons over the last 4 years. 85% or 86% from conventional energy, and then just 4.5% from what I call subsidy energy. This subsidy energy, it wouldn't exist if it weren't for the subsidies provided by the federal government. Okay, so we pay an awful lot of money for that energy. So where does it go? And what's really interesting is we actually export close to 50% of the oil we import. We process it, we manage it, and then we turn around and we export half of it. So our net imports are actually just 50% of our exports on a net basis. The rest of it we use to heat and run our buildings where we work, our homes where we live. We use it to move around in transport, whether it's on planes, trains, and automobiles. And then we use it in our industries that enable all the products we use to live the life that we have. So if it wasn't for energy, we would live in a totally different world. It'd be back in the caveman era. So what are the Trump administration's energy goals and strategy, and what does it really mean to dominate energy? Take a look at that. So today, the president announced that we're going to usher in a new American energy policy, not only focusing on energy independence, but energy dominance. And I already mentioned that, really caught my attention. So he said in 4 areas, we want to begin to revive and expand our nuclear energy sector with a complete review of nuclear energy policy in this country as a ways to revitalize its critical energy source. We want to increase U.S. coal exports. I actually thought we imported a lot of coal, export a lot of coal. We don't export, we export virtually no coal. And we'll show you what those numbers look like. We want to boost American energy exports of crude oil. The Obama administration in 2016 allowed for the export of crude oil, and it is making a difference, a big difference. And we'll take a look at what that means. And then we want to globally market American natural gas. The Department of Energy has approved additional applications to export LNG from Louisiana. I'll show you the magnitude of the LNG exports that are going on right here in this state, over on the west side, over by Lake Charles. They are massive. And then finally, offshore oil and gas, the part of the business that I actually engage in, they want to totally revamp the offshore energy policy in the country. Right now, we can only really drill offshore in the central and western Gulf of Mexico. The majority of the U.S. offshore waters are off limits to oil and gas exploration. So our country will no longer be vulnerable to foreign regimes that use energy as an economic weapon. American families will have access to cheaper energy and reliable energy, allowing them to keep more of their hard-earned dollars and have access to more jobs and opportunities. That to me is significant. One of the things that was really profound for me in my life, really, is when my son joined the Louisiana National Guard and he ended up activated. And the Louisiana National Guard is a combat unit. So he's in combat in Iraq. And you drive home from work every day and you just hope you don't see a sedan in the driveway. And there were bad days for the Louisiana Guard. They had 8 guys killed in one day. Stressful times. And you get to thinking, good Lord, why is he over there? It is energy. If it wasn't for the energy that we have to acquire from that area of the world and the unstable characteristics, all that revenue going into that area of the world enables them to do, it is about oil. It's about the instability it creates by not supporting ourselves with our own energy policy. So I was really excited to see what President Trump is attempting to do with energy dominance. So what does dominance really mean? The Cabinet Secretaries Rick Perry, Scott Pruitt at EPA, and Ryan Zinke and Interior stated that dominance means we are a self-reliant and secure nation, free from the geopolitical turmoil of other nations seek to use energy as an economic weapon. And energy-dominant America will export to markets around the world, increasing our global leadership and influence. And for the first time in decades, the energy story in the U.S. will be about becoming an energy exporter and no longer about peak resources, be it oil or others, and being beholden to other foreign powers. And for years, in the opinion of the administration, Washington got in the way of such an energy dominance, and that was going to change now. So using the Trump administration definition and understanding of dominance, the U.S. will dominate in energy sectors if we can achieve 2 objectives. If we can meet all of our domestic demands, and then we could export to markets around the world at a level where we can influence the market. Pretty clear, I think, in terms of defining dominance. So the question is, can we do it? In the 80s and then 1990s, OPEC dominated oil on a global basis. The data I'll show you shows that right now Australia and Indonesia dominate coal. Australia also dominates in LNG, liquefied natural gas. So where can America dominate? That's the question I hope to answer. So taking a look at a SWOT analysis. Strengths. You know, we have a strong resource position. I'll show you the numbers in hydrocarbons, coal, gas, and oil. We have world-class technology in the extraction capabilities, both onshore and offshore, and I showed you that last year, what we can do offshore. We are an entrepreneurial society. We respond quickly to market forces, to quickly uptake new technology, better than anyone else on the planet. We are the largest energy-consuming economy in the world, which brings some opportunities there in terms of efficiency. And we have the strongest existing energy distribution network in the world, both pipelines, transport, and energy refining. And we have access to the world's financial markets, which is a huge advantage. We do have, relative on a global scale, a stable political culture. And then that brings forward confidence of the financial markets to invest in companies where I work and other companies to put their money on the line to generate energy. It's a huge advantage for us. And we actually have a mature and generally effective regulatory environment. I really think that in the U.S., that's an advantage to us, that mature regulatory environment. It's not perfect, But overall, I think it works well for us, and I actually consider it a strength. A weakness, the existing and the prior federal policies focused on higher cost, less reliable energy production. The amount of subsidies that went into renewables and the gain we got from it, as you can see from the current energy mix, it's just a misappropriation of priorities. And we've actually discouraged lower cost, reliable hydrocarbon-based energy production. Why? It's the fear of greenhouse gases. And as most of us in here believe, that is a fear that's way overstated. The regulatory environment historically underestimates the cost and it overestimates the benefits of additional regulation. We need good, sound, reasonable regulations, but they shouldn't be regulation to the point where it actually inhibits the actual industry you're trying to regulate. And energy commodity markets are not primarily driven by market forces. Computers manage a lot of our equity markets, and computers now manage a lot of our commodity markets. And we see wild swings in oil price that are more generated by the trends that a computer has identified, so someone can make money on the margin rather than a true in supply and demand. Opportunities, efficiency gains. We're the world's largest energy economy. So if we could become more efficient for the right reasons, because it makes economic sense, not because we're trying to achieve some nebulous environmental goal, not that all environmental goals are nebulous, but it's something I think is a great opportunity for us. Fully understanding our energy resources. We do not live in a world of physical scarcity. In fact, when it comes to a lot of our energy resources, I don't think we know what we don't know. There's that much uncertainty out there. I mentioned last year the best place to look for oil is in an oil field. And I'm going to give you an unbelievable example of that when we take a look at the Permian Basin. Okay? Threats. I honestly believe, and some people get offended when I say this, but U.S. society is relatively technologically illiterate. And the trend is in the wrong direction. Can the public understand and support an energy policy that considers all of the pluses and minuses of each energy source, especially nuclear and hydrocarbon-based energy? Right now, I'd have to say predominantly no. Regulatory enforcement is under increasing political influence, both ways. We saw a huge swing to more prescriptive regulations under the Obama administration, and now we're seeing a swing back away from prescriptive when what we really need to see are performance-based regulations. That's a regulation where the federal government comes in and says, Joe, I want you to manage this risk. Got it. You show me how you're going to manage that risk. That's performance-based regulation. That allows me to take the ingenuity, the efficiency of my staff to get the job done. And a lot of areas of the world do that, but not here in the States. We're still prescriptive. And I'm hoping that'll change under the new administration. Our cost trends make U.S. energy non-competitive. We are not the low-cost producer in oil. Saudi Arabia certainly is. And we're also not the low-cost producer in our nuclear fuels. I'll show you what numbers are there. And the coastal states are likely to enact policies actually discouraging the export of American hydrocarbon energy. So those are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So can we dominate oil? Do we meet our current domestic demand? Do we have the reserves to dominate? How much excess capacity do we have to actually generate exports? And do we have the mechanisms and policies to enable exports? So here is our current oil mix. This is where we import it from. Most people don't realize our biggest source is Canada, followed by the Saudi Arabian, Middle East light crudes, the heavy crudes from Venezuela, and then Mexico. So those three countries dominate where we get our imports from. But what's even more interesting is where we export to, Mexico. We actually export more from Mexico than we import. We are a net exporter of oil to Mexico. Canada. We actually export a considerable amount to Canada. What do we export to Canada? We export the lightweight crudes and the condensates to thin the oil from the tar sands so it'll flow better in the pipelines. So it's almost a very beneficial relationship between the U.S. and Canada. I was surprised to see how much we export to China. This is more refined products than it is crude oil, but we're actually starting to export crude oil from the offshore production in the U.S. Gulf Coast to China. We can compete given the current economics. We export refined products to Bill. We totally dominate already the Caribbean and the Caribbean, predominantly the Caribbean. All their products generally come from the U.S. that they use in their exports. So that's where it comes and that's where it goes. The things that are rather interesting is we get Canada and Mexico are 47% of our imports, which is greater than the 35% we get from OPEC. Combine the two together, and that's where 82% of our imports of oil products and crude oil comes from. Where it goes to a mixture of places. It goes to Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean, Central and South America, Europe and Asia and Africa, 18%, and Asia, 24%. So can we meet the U.S. oil demand? This is what we import. This is what we export. And you'll notice there's a definite change in the curve. And you can see the curve is going in the right direction. And this is what we export in terms of crude oil. Initially, we were under restrictions and all we exported were refined products. And then when the fracking revolution came in and really took off in the 2008 timeframe, we started to export the condensate from fracking. So when natural gas comes out of the well and it's at a high pressure, you lower the pressure, liquids drop out. It's like condensation on your shower door. Okay? So those liquids drop off, and they're very, very volatile liquids. It's more like the gasoline type crude oils, but we could export that because the definition was that was not crude oil. So we would export fracking condensate used to thin the crudes in other areas and make it into a more valuable product, and now we're actually exporting crude oil itself. So there you can see the gap. We had the maximum amount was 13.2 million barrels of oil a day was our net imports in 2007, and now we're down to 4.6 million. So net imports have actually dropped by 65%. I don't think most people realize that. And projecting forward, if we can continue on these trends, we could actually see a close to the point to where we're a net exporter, I feel, in as short as 5 years. So that would be pretty impressive if we could do that. Hydrocarbon basics, these are the molecules that make up hydrocarbons. It's just the polymerization of your methane molecule. If you take methane, which is a carbon and 4 hydrogens, put another one together and bond the 2 carbon, you get ethane, propane, butane, pentane, octane, all the way up to molecules that are as long as 40 carbon chains. And in the bitumen and the heavy oil in Canada, it gets into unbelievable molecular numbers. So we get really long molecules. And the lightweight crudes that you have in the US and the condensates from fracking, they blend them in with the heavy crudes, so now I've got a mixture I can easily transport, I get better refining yields, the overall utility of the final oil actually goes up. So that's the biggest reason why America's been able to actually start exporting crude. It's not because other countries are using it as a fuel source, they're using it as a way to enhance their own hydrocarbon resources, especially Venezuela and Canada. So the US crudes from the Gulf of Mexico, along with condensates and the very light shale oils, they're ideal for blending with the heavy crude in Canada, in the tar sands, and also in South America. And offshore right now is actually driving US oil exports. The lightweight crudes from the Gulf of Mexico, especially in the Mississippi Canyon, the Green Canyon area, are ideal blending crudes. And we're seeing a huge increase in the export of that. From the Gulf of Mexico, we're currently exporting a couple 100,000 barrels a day. Going to the export market. So that's helping support the prices, it's helping support my crews and our company. So where are the world's proven oil reserves? Well, you can see they're not in the US. Venezuela, this is a reserves over production ratio. The vast majority of reserves need to be blended with lightweight crudes, like I already mentioned, which is definitely an opportunity for us to increase exports. Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, then Canada. Interesting. See, Canada so high up on the list of proven oil reserves. Then you have Iran, Iraq, Russia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Libya, then the US. At a total billion barrels, 48 billion barrels of proved reserves. At the rate we consume oil in our country, that's good for 10 years. That is an extremely low reserves to production ratio for a country that wants to dominate long term. Okay? And this is the overall reserves to production ratio by region. By the way, all of my numbers are coming from either EIA or they're coming from the BP Energy Report. BP does a fabulous job summarizing global energy. What's interesting is, in Venezuela, 70% of their crude reserves, they're the largest in the world, but 70% is this awful heavy goo called Orinoco Belt crude. It actually has to be steamed to get the rock to release it. They go through thermal processes. They go through all kinds of enhanced oil recovery processes. There's a lot of it. But in order to make that product that's usable, they actually have to blend it with a lot of other crudes. So there's an opportunity again for the U.S. Next question is, do the global oil and gas reserves, do they fully account for the fracking revolution that's going on in the United States? I don't think they do. And this came out just earlier this year in April, where Pioneer Resources, a large resource holder in the Permian Basin, made this statement. And I found it interesting. Ghar, the largest oil field in Saudi Arabia, they feel the Permian oil and the U.S. shale gas could potentially fill global demand because they believe if you take into full account what we're getting from fracking in our oil reservoirs, even just the Permian Basin, that puts us on a level of Saudi Arabia and Ghar. So we've been producing in the Permian Basin ever since the days of the glory days of the Texas oil field, and to date, a total of about 35 billion barrels has been produced. But now, due to fracking and the technology that it employs and what that's able to generate, this is what still remains in the Midland area, in the Delaware Basin, or the Permian Basin in Texas. And you can make a case that the U.S. now holds more oil reserves than Saudi Arabia. Is that true? I don't know. This is coming from a man whose company is publicly traded. He may be correct, he may not be correct. But I tell you what, when you look at some of the numbers, you're more inclined to believe him than not. So that's kind of rather interesting. So the answer, I think, is no. I don't think they fully take it into account. So what is the impact if we take this level of oil reserves simply from the Permian Basin, the reserve estimate from Pioneer Resources? What if their estimate is correct? The USA gains 135 billion barrels in reserves. And suddenly this chart looks like that chart. The U.S. now has reserves on par with Saudi Arabia. And it's a lightweight crude. It's a lightweight crude that we can now use to blend with other crudes. So now our lightweight crude, if that is truly the number, gets blended with the Venezuelan heavy crude and even the Canadian heavy crude, such that the reserves over production ratio goes to here. And now the U.S. and Canadian RP ratio is very competitive with the Middle East. So can we dominate oil? It could actually be possible. Well, wait a minute. What if the rest of the world goes through the same thing? All right, this is the EIA's estimate of all the shale basins around the world. If we're going to do it, aren't they going to do it? Isn't it just going to happen? So is potential U.S. oil dominance in oil mitigated by similar shale developments on a global basis? Well, it's possible. It's a resource. It's there. But is it likely? No, it's not likely. And here's why. The U.S. mineral rights ownership model is unique in the world. Only in the United States can the landowner, be it the homeowner or the farmer, actually has financial rights to the minerals under his property. Elsewhere, there is no rights. They absolutely have no rights with regard to mineral ownership. And I found it interesting, in the U.S., 61% of the land is privately held. So private landowners hold the value of U.S. minerals at a level of 61%, if you assume the resource is evenly distributed. The federal government lands comprise 39%. That's the national parks, national forests, BLM land, predominantly in the West. Canada has an equally impressive shale resource region. However, only 9% of the Canadian fields are held by private individuals. 91% is crown land. It's totally controlled by the federal government. So with little to financial incentive to deal with the temporary surface impacts associated with drilling and production outside the U.S., there's also relatively little support for fracking and oil and gas development. Think about it. If you're a landowner in England and you get no value from the wells that go into your land, the disruption that's, even though it's temporary, are you going to support something like that when you don't get any value from it? I don't think so. So I think the mineral rights structure in the U.S., it actually enables a diverse range of oil and gas companies. We don't have a national oil company in the U.S. We have a mixture of small companies, medium-sized, and large multinational companies. So we have a great diversity of companies. They all operate in a different manner. They operate in a different sector of the business, but they're all operating efficiently. And together, we see a better, more efficient development of our resources than anywhere else on the planet. So that is a huge advantage, and that's why I just don't think you're going to see the fracking revolution continue in other areas of the world like you're seeing it in the U.S. Rotary drilling on land and offshore drilling starting here in Louisiana, it started and to a large degree it remains a U.S.-based industry from a technology standpoint. And I think the fracking revolution is going to follow that same path. And that's a huge advantage for us in the sense that from a reserves position basis, onshore fracking is likely to remain a globally competitive advantage to the U.S. And offshore, we're also seeing the tight oil reserves that are huge becoming economic. In November, my company will start developing an area on a project called Buckskin. There's 1 billion barrels of oil in place at Buckskin. We think that through the fracking we can do offshore, we could probably get anywhere from 8 to 9% of that resource produced economically. But that's still enough of a carrot to go for it. So we're going to invest probably around $1.2 billion, and we're going to go out there and try and develop Buckskin. And my boss is telling me if we can find a way to improve our completions and we can just get 2% more recovery out of that area, man, the economics look absolutely outstanding. So that's the level of resource that we have and the positions that we have as a country. So the reserves question. I mean, in terms of oil, we are a lot like Venezuela. We have the resources, but do we really have the reserves? Resources are not reserves. And I think the public gets that confused a lot. The resource is what's physically there. I just mentioned at Buckskin, there are billions of barrels in the ground at Buckskin, but I can only get millions of barrels out, okay? Reserves are the portion of the resource that I can get out and actually make money. I can get it out of the ground and make money on it. It's only resources are only the first step to dominance. In the end, its reserves is what really matters. Does the U.S. only have big reserves that we only can produce when prices are high, say $60, $70 a barrel oil, or can we compete at the low prices? And more importantly, how low is low? So it's interesting. I think the first thing you have to answer is, what oil price do you assume? And here's oil prices over time, over the last 40 years, normalized in 2015 dollars. So I like to use the average Joe oil price. That's the inflation-adjusted price. So what is the price at which oil was above half the time or below half the time? And it turns out that price is right between $50 and $55. This morning, where's oil? $50 a barrel. So we're always conservative as engineers, put a little safety factor on there. So if I can make money on these long-term projects in the $40 to $50 a barrel range, long-term, she's going to pay off. So that's what we ought to use as our benchmark. So this is a slide. I went to a conference from Bloomberg last week, and I found this fascinating. Because last year, when I met with you guys, I laid out the price of the shale oil plays. And this is what they've done since the last time the data we had for the last one was here. That's where the data, but there's the trend. If my average Joe oil price is correct, then every single major resource play, the Bakken in North Dakota, the Eagle Ford in South Texas, the Permian fields in the Delaware and the Midland basins, every single one of them is economic at $40 to $50 a barrel. So that is encouraging. So that tells you that the resource that we have in the ground is actually a reserve at those oil prices. So I think the answer is yes, we can. One of the curious things about shale oil is the production trends, the flush and the tail. On shale oil, you get this rapid production that comes out. This is the data I had last year. At the first full month, the wells come in at a 200 to 250 barrels a day, and then they rapidly decline. After a year, it's down to 50, and after 2 years, you're down to the stripper well production that used to dominate America. So the question is, the flush production is impressive, and the peak is quite fast and dramatic. The long-term production tail is only a fraction of the initial flush production. So why is that? And I think the reason why is that in oil shale, the rock is very low permeability. Over years, millions of years, the rock is stressed and it gets cracks developed. The rock will be thrusted up, down thrusted in some areas, up thrusted. The formations have to bend. They don't like to bend, so they crack. Oil then migrates out of the shale rock layer. It only may migrate a foot or two, and it fills the cracks. So we'll come along with a rig and we'll drill horizontally, staying in the oil-rich shale layer, and we'll link up all the cracks. And once I link them up, I'll enhance production by fracking it, and I'll turn it on. But I get a lot of flush oil, and once the flush oil is done, all the oil comes out of the cracks, and I have to worry about oil flowing in the matrix of the rock to my well. It's really slow, because it's really tight. Oil's got the long chain molecule I just showed you. So those long chain molecules struggle to get out, and most of them don't get out. Only the lighter ones get out. That's why the crude oil coming from shale is very light, because because only the smaller molecules can make it through this, through the tight shale space. So is that what we see? This is what we have. This is the data I had last year, okay? But now they're going in using nanoparticles to fracture the shales. They're using these interesting chemistry to actually link it up, take away the interfacial tension, and actually free and optimize production coming from that fracture network. So now this is what we've seen just over the last 2 years. 1,400 barrels a day is the initial production. So this is what leading the Pioneer Resources Manager to say the Permian Basin is the size of Gahar. It's huge. And I really still, to this day, I still worry about, is it just going to drop off? Are we still going to see these declines? Only time will tell. So it's an interesting thing going forward. We've had huge gains. Have we reached a maximum? I think we have. But I tell you what, when it comes to predicting what the future and the actual productivity of American shale is, I have a perfect record. I have been 100% wrong. And I think that just probably goes to show my bias. I compete against these guys. I have to produce in the Deepwater Gulf of Mexico against these guys. I just can't believe they're doing what they're doing. It doesn't make physical sense to me. But hey, that's what I got to deal with. More importantly, are we really adding new reserves? Or are we simply accelerating the oil forward in time because we're optimizing the production from the cracks? I honestly don't know. So it's one of the things we'll have to see. If these productivity gains can be sustained and it actually represents additional oil reserves, then absolutely the U.S. can and will dominate oil on a global basis. There's peak oil that we had in the country back in 1970. This is the fracking revolution. And last year when I met here, I said, look how it's declining because the flush production we've stopped drilling. We went down to a record low rig count. And in the last year, the rig count for onshore rigs has gone from 400 back up to 1,000 in a year. And in a year's time frame, this dropping rig count, I felt it exposed our dependence on the initial flush oil production. And will the fall equal the rise? Well, can the U.S. resurgence continue in $40 to $50 oil? And the answer is yes, it can. Here's how quickly it's turned around. As soon as the rig count came back, oil production came back. So the surge in oil continues as the U.S. onshore and offshore also produced record oil this year. And now onshore is produced back up on the ramp towards record oil production, led by the Permian Basin. And the EIA projects for 2018 that we will be close to the maximum peak this country has ever produced of 10 million barrels a day. Interesting stuff. So can we dominate oil? Do we meet our current domestic demand? Not yet, but we're on a course to be a net exporter in about 5 years. Do we have the reserves? Yes, if we can sustain the offshore production and grow onshore oil in the 40 to 50 barrel range. And the numbers indicate that we can. Do we have excess capacity to generate exports? Under some scenarios, we have the export capacity to match any nation in terms of reserves. Still have to get it to market. Do we have the mechanisms and policies to enable exports? With the Obama administration in their final years removing the crude oil export ban, that has been a big enabler of American exports. So I think the answer is yes, we can dominate oil. What about the next one, natural gas? Can we dominate it? Can we meet our current demand? Do we have the reserves? How much excess capacity do we have to generate exports? And do we have mechanisms and policies to encourage exports? So here's natural gas production, and here's consumption. You notice the USA is clearly the world's leader in natural gas production. We passed Russia a few years ago, and we've really gone past Russia. We are now producing 21% of the world's natural gas. Russia's next at 16. And when you consider this as a global measure, that is a huge difference. So we're producing 749 billion cubic meters of natural gas a year. And you can see how the other players play out. What's of interest is that we also are the world's largest consumer, easily doubling the next nation, that would be Russia, in natural gas consumption. So we're the global leader. We definitely meet all our domestic demand. And from 2005 to 2009, we're actually starting to prepare our Gulf Coast ports. Those projects were actually started to import natural gas. And they started construction, they shut them down, and they flipped it. and they're now going to export natural gas. So that's fascinating in my view. On the consumption side, our growth has been fueled by low natural gas prices and the regulatory move against coal via the Clean Power Plan. It's just so much more attractive for power plants now to burn coal from both a regulatory basis as well as cost basis. Significant movers in natural gas is China. They're increasing both their production and their consumption. Their production is up 10.3% over 10 years. Ours is up 4%. We just have a much larger scale. But look at their growth in gas consumption at 15%. Qatar, they're top 5 simply due to their exports. They're one of the largest exporters of natural gas in the world. And what's really interesting is take a look at the policies of the UK and Germany. Their natural gas use is actually down. I found that to be really interesting. Their aversion to fossil fuels and wanting to burn wood chips, as Paul went over last night, they're actually down on natural gas. That, to me, is insanity. So I found it kind of fascinating. Where's the world's natural gas reserves? Unfortunately, they're not here. Look at that. Our natural gas reserves are only 4%. We're the largest producer in the world. We're the largest consumer by far, but yet we only have 4.7% of the world's natural gas at 308 trillion cubic feet. Now, it's gone up a lot with the fracking revolution, but our reserves, they increased 100% from 2013 to 15. No reserve increase in 16, mainly because we stopped drilling for gas. We're drilling for oil right now in the fracking revolution. So low natural gas prices, a historic low gas rig count. The oil-gas price spread favors drilling for oil, not gas. And the increased productivity of the tight oil fracks, especially in the Permian Basin, is now taking the drilling resource. So it's interesting. So the U.S. and Canada also, due to our high rates of consumption, we have the lowest R over P, reserves to production ratio in the world at 12. So if you believe the reserve numbers, if we didn't stop drilling for gas entirely, we'd run out in 12 years and have to go drill some more or prove up some more reserves. Imports and exports. We are just a minor player in exports. As you can see right here, exporting LNG. It's increased, but on the global scale, we play a minor role in LNG exports. Exports would have to increase 20-fold for the U.S. to dominate natural gas and get up here and compete with Qatar and Australia. So we really have to increase our reserves at the lowest cost, and we have to offset the relatively high natural gas transport and handling costs. So here's a natural gas transport model. I got to get the gas from my fields. I take it to a gas gathering manifold plant. I send it to a liquefaction plant where I compress the gas and cool it and turn it into a liquid, put it into storage, put it on tankers, send it over to the export market where they discharge it. They expand the gas, put it into storage, either electrify it or send it into their local distribution network. It costs $1.50 to $2 per 1,000 cubic feet of gas to compress it. All right, and then it takes another 50 cents to $1.20 to transport it. And then in order to take it from a liquid back to a gas and sell it, it's another 30 to 40 cents. So if I add it all up, my total LNG life cycle cost, I got to spend an extra $2.30 at best, or possibly as high as $3.60. So now you got to look at what can I get from my gas? Well, right here, due to fracking, we produce gas at some of the lowest costs in the world in terms of the sales market. So you can take the U.S. gas, and I can then put it on the international market, and it's a no-brainer. When they first started installing the plants, that's the margin you had. Clearly, much more than $3. So you can make money by buying gas cheap in the U.S. and exporting it and selling it on the international markets. But the margins have closed. And now we're into the challenge zone. That does not look like a good $3 margin because there's $3 and there's $6. So that's a challenge for us. This is the World Bank's natural gas price forecast going forward. This, if you wanted to buy gas at one of the hubs in the U.S., Henry Hub is the largest. This is the projected gas price at Henry Hub. Throw on those same margins where it's going to cost me an additional $2.30 to $3.60 to get that MCF of gas to Europe, and all of a sudden it's really not economic right now to export gas to Europe. And even projecting forward, if I had some efficiencies and I could get that 230 down to 175 and the 360 to 275, Europe is going to remain a struggle to make money, but Asia isn't. The long-term projection, in my view, is we're best positioned to compete in Asia and not necessarily Europe. So this is what you're seeing going on in Louisiana right now. You have a manufacturing boom fueled by the natural gas projects, $60 billion in ongoing developments, but $42 billion is just the 4 natural gas export facilities going in over by Lake Charles. So huge amount of project work going on. And on the West Coast, just last month, Jordan Cove LNG is moving forward its improvements to export natural gas out of Oregon to the Asian markets. So we're seeing things happening. So do we meet our current demand? Yeah, we do. And exports, they're increasing significantly, but they're still a minor player on the global stage. Do we have the reserves to dominate? Possibly, but the uncertainty is huge, as I already mentioned, especially on gas. What are the true reserves that we have? I think the uncertainty is huge, but our unique land ownership model in the United States enables us to actually make it happen and get the most out of that resource. How much excess capacity that we have? Short term, we have capacity, but I already mentioned about that R/P ratio of 12. Our reserves right now are so low, we could produce them in just 12 years with what we currently have in the reserves bank, if you will. So long term, I think it's a question mark. Do we have the mechanisms and policies to enable exports? I think we do. And if we project forward the typical United States upstream industry optimization and efficiencies, I do think we will become a global leader in LNG exports. So yeah, I think we can, but there's a whole lot of challenges here when it comes to gas. What about coal? Can we meet our current domestic demand? Do we have the reserves? How much excess capacity do we have? And do we have mechanisms and policies to enable exports? Here's a global chart of coal. The only thing in this scale is red. Globally, over 4 billion short tons of coal are produced. China produced 1.8 out of that 4 billion. And here's the US. We're number 2, but we're not even close. In fact, we're declining. Here's the results of the war on coal. Paul mentioned last night, our coal production is down 39% from our peak when Obama took office. So that has represented a devastation to the American coal industry. In fact, all of the global decline in production comes from the USA and China. In China, it's the economic downturn and the air pollution concerns. In the US, it's competition from natural gas and the war on coal. Can we dominate coal? Domestically, yes, we supply 100% of our demand, and even we export some coal. Internationally, can we dominate coal? Yes, and it's a big if we can get our coal to market. So here's the current coal proved reserves. From a reserve standpoint, we have 22% of the world's reserves. China's pretty close at 21%. And the Russian Federation, Australia, interesting, dominates the export market, but they only have 12% of the global coal. So we can compete in the export market. The reserves are there. We have the largest coal reserves in the world. We actually can supply our demand for 381 years. That's our coal reserves that we have. China's a close 2. But they only supply 88% of their internal demand, and they're still an importer of coal. So can we compete on the global marketplace? Where is the coal in the US? Where's the coal export market? It's in Asia. While both global coal production is down a little bit, it's projected to rise again in 2018 and actually peak at over 4 billion barrels of oil equivalent of coal in the year 2025. But here's the export market. Positive number of people import, the negative number is import. China, India, Japan, Taiwan, that's where the import market is. It's Asia. Australia and Indonesia, there's the export numbers, 256 and 193. So the US, our coal exports are on par with Poland. So we're not exporting very much coal. So can we export to the Middle East? Most of our coal is in Wyoming. I'll show you a table in a minute that's quite striking. In the US, we have high BTU coal in the east, and you can see it fetches a hefty price on the global market. The Wyoming coal, we can actually produces a current domestic price of just around $11.25. And it's a lower BTU coal, so its value on the global market is right now is about $43. But it's $12 from rail to port, $11 shipping on the ocean from port to port. So we're arriving at the distribution hub at $35 per ton. you can definitely make money on it right now. So you got a $5 to $10 per ton export profit. But you're only selling it in Wyoming for $11.25, and you can get an additional profit through exports of up to $10. You can pretty much double the price of your coal. And it's the easiest coal to get to, because in just 16 mines in Wyoming, the coal in the Powder River Basin is a couple hundred feet below the surface, and it's 300 feet thick is the seam. Easiest coal to get to in the world. So therefore it can be, it's low BTU, but it's also low sulfur. So it has some very attractive qualities. Here's the capacity, and this is what we're doing now. If you add up in the US, we're actually producing 895 short tons of coal a year, but we have the ability to do 895 million over 1.1 billion tons of coal. So the US coal mines have an excess capacity equal to the exports of Australia. So we can absolutely export our coal. Our coal reserves are in the west, dominated by Wyoming and Montana, but in Wyoming, we export domestically. The state exports domestically 98%, only 2% makes its way to the export markets on the West Coast. So if we're going to dominate coal globally, here's where the global dominance is. This is the coal that Australia puts out, Indonesia puts out, and we got little trickles coming off of each of our coasts. So Asia's the prime market. The low-cost export path for Wyoming coal is via the U.S. West Coast ports. California, Washington, Oregon, state politics is preventing Wyoming from accessing their markets. And I don't really understand how you can do this. In my mind, is it not a violation of interstate commerce? But that Washington State has blocked plans for the nation's largest coal export terminal in Oregon along the Columbia River. They've also blocked the plans. So I think you're going to see a lawsuit from the state of Wyoming against those states for restricting access to export their coal. So can America dominate coal? We certainly can meet our demand. We have the reserves, we have the excess capacity, and we have the ports, but we need the export policies. So it's all there to dominate. It's just getting the export policies in place to where we can. Nuclear energy, real quick, the status of nuclear energy in the U.S. The U.S. is still the largest producer in kilowatts of nuclear energy on the planet. That surprised me. I thought France was going to produce more. But if you do it on a per capita basis, oh, we're way down there. We're not up close to the top. Sweden, France, Finland, and Belgium, they're actually up on the top. So I found that rather interesting. We are the global leader in energy and nuclear energy production. We produce 30%, 32% of the world's nuclear energy, but on a per capita basis, we lag many countries. The green movement in Germany has reduced their nuclear energy by 49%, and in Japan, the Fukushima, I don't know if I spelled that correctly, 94% reduction in nuclear energy in Japan. So that was rather striking. China, India, and Russia are the strong growth rates for nuclear energy in the last 10 years. And the U.S., our uranium, this surprised me. We import 89% of our uranium. We only produce 11%. In fact, we only have 6 mines, 5 in Wyoming, 1 in Nebraska. Our U.S. uranium production is at the same level that we were in the 1940s. So that's, boy, from a resource standpoint, we're a minor player. So can we dominate nuclear energy? No. We have to find a different fuel resource. What's the status of our nuclear fuel reserves? They're minimal. From a fuel reserve standpoint, on a global scale, and the trends are down, do we have the capability and capacity to generate nuclear energy to export to the American grid? In a political sense, no, we do not. So I know Trump wants to expand American nuclear energy. I wish him the best of luck, but I actually do not think that we can dominate nuclear energy. Renewables. Do we meet our current demand? No, we do not meet our current demand for renewables. Why? Because demand for renewables is a totally media manufactured demand. It's marketing. And Willie, I've got a new slide for you to use, so pay attention real quick, okay? What is our capacity to generate renewable electricity to export to the North American grid? I've got a big question mark. Visual effects, hydroelectric, I think we're close to maximized out. I can't see any more dams being approved in this country, nor do I think the sites are probably there. Wind turbines have to be in an exposed area, therefore they're visible. A lot of people, including myself, find them unsightly. They're interesting at first, but then the romance wears off real quick. All right? A lot of people have concerns with the larger new generation turbines. The noise. The wind turbines produce aerodynamic noise. I've seen some reports of people claiming that they actually get ill from it. Don't know how legitimate that is. Better designs have reduced the noise, but wind farms have been developed from highly populated areas by definition. It's less offensive, but not to the people who live in those locations. Electromagnetic interference. Wind turbines scatter electromagnetic signals, cause interference to communication systems, so that's another thing you got to take into consideration when you do siting. The Gulf of Mexico hypoxia zone, rarely mentioned, but it's going on right now at the worst level ever in history, and I'll show you what that looks like. And then bird safety. Paul mentioned things about birds, so I'm going to touch on that a little bit. The hypoxia zone. Every year, coming out of the mouth of the Mississippi at the end of the Delta, comes all the runoff from America's farms. All the farm waste, all the nutrients, the fertilizers that don't get uptaken, they all come out through the Mississippi. Comes out into the waters of the Gulf, and over the summer you get phytoplankton blooms. It just blooms, and then it dies. Later in the summer it dies, it settles down, and it takes all the oxygen out of the water. And the fish that can move. The creatures that can't move fast enough, well, they're killed. And right now we're looking at a hypoxia zone that is actually the largest ever. It's the size of New Jersey, offshore, predominantly right here. And when you drive across it in a boat, it just looks ugly. It's disgusting. And I really think it's related, well, I know it's related to weather, it's related to the water temperature, and it's related to the nutrients. So someone mentioned yesterday that in order to combat CO2, let's put fertilizer in the oceans. Are you kidding me? We already do it right here, and it's a disaster. We're looking at record corn production, a lot of it for ethanol, and we also have record production of soybean acreage. So I think the two are related. We've got record amount of acreage in farms, and all the runoff from that creates the hypoxia zones. So do we really want to create more of that by going to more corn ethanol? I don't think so. We've got a perception that the oil and gas industry is not held to tough enough environmental standards. I'd like to cite this example. ExxonMobil agreed to pay $600,000 in fines after 85 migratory birds died after exposure to hydrocarbons in some of their open pits. They should have had nets on them. They didn't. Well, they deserve to be fined. You can argue about being fined to this amount, but dude, come on. That's a clear regulation. You didn't follow it, so you deserve to be fined. Okay, great. So the fine amounted to $7,000 per dead bird. Well, Wildlife Society did a review of it, and this is peer-reviewed literature. If the wind industry operating in the same footprint in the Midwest is held to the same standard, there were 573,000 bird fatalities in this study per year. 83,000 were raptors. So let's just value the raptors alone. If we apply 83,000 raptors to 7,000 per bird, all right, and then you take that each year, you're going to get $581 million a year, and then if you really wanted to go regulatory anal, and you apply the 7,000 to 573, you get the $4 billion a year in a subsidy to the wind industry that the oil industry certainly doesn't enjoy. Renewable energy, I'm down to 5 minutes, so I'm quickly going to cover the Tesla. All right, now my son put this together for me, and out there the perception is electric cars have no emissions. So I charge my car at the Tesla station or my house, I pay the bill, and I drive with no CO2 emissions. Yay! But where does the electricity come from? It comes from the wall outlet. Well, where does the wall outlet get it from? It gets it from the power plant. And maybe it's coming from wind, maybe solar, minor. Most of it's coming from the fossil fuel or the nuclear power plant, powered by coal, a little bit by oil, and a lot by natural gas. So that way, or there's this way. I get it the old-fashioned way. Oil goes to my gas station, haul, and I fill up there. So let's do an analysis of the Tesla. And let's look at California first, okay? And this was surprising to me. So I looked at California. This is the total electricity sources in California. Where do they get their electricity? Very little from coal, all right? They import some electricity generated from coal from abroad, all right? Hydro, natural gas, nuclear, oil, other petroleum products, and then renewables. 25% of their electricity in the California power mix comes from renewables, biomass, geothermal, small hydro, solar, and wind. Well, if I'm going to plug in my car, I need more energy. So I'm not going to get more energy from hydro. It's maxed out in California. I'm not going to get more energy from nuclear. They're not going to allow any more nuclear plants, so those come out. So if we assume that I can do more from coal only if I import it into the state, I can do more from natural gas, no oil, and I'm going to go renewables. So that means out of my 100%, 80% of all of my new energy comes from these sources, which add up to 80% of my current total. Then you take the number from EPA on the pounds of CO2 per kilowatt hour generated by coal, add it all up, and you come up with a weighted average of 1.3 pounds of CO2. And if I plug that into what my Tesla advertises, and Tesla advertises that if I go 50 miles, I need 16.6 kilowatts at 1.3 pounds of CO2 per kilowatt, I get 21.6, okay? But my Honda Accord gets 35 miles to the gallon, so I'm going to use 1.4 gallons to go those 50 miles. So I'll actually put 28 pounds of CO2 in the air by driving my Honda Accord. So I actually do indeed reduce my CO2 emissions by going to the electric vehicle, but only in California and only because of the reliability on renewables, okay? Now, California also has the highest electricity prices in the country. Well, what about the rest of us? So let's take that same look to the rest of us. This is the electric mix of the United States. Here, we're only getting 8% from renewables. A lot of it comes from coal. And now we're looking at 2.2 pounds of CO2 per kilowatt hour. I plug in those same economics, and now all of a sudden, I'm generating 33 pounds of CO2 by plugging my car into the wall. And I'm only going to get 28 pounds of CO2 by going through the pump at the station. So for the majority of Americans, the answer is no. You're going to put more CO2 into the atmosphere. You're going to put more, you're going to certainly pay more in the total cost of ownership, and you're going to wait a long time to fuel your vehicle. To charge it up at your house, even boosting the voltage to 220, you're still going to have a charge time equal to 1.5 hours, all right? So if every hour you drive at 60, you're going to take 2 hours to charge your car. So you better have a charger station where you're going. Otherwise, you're just going to have an extended stay wherever you're going, okay? If I believe I need to reduce my carbon footprint to save the planet, I should focus on efficiency and not drive around on an electric car. Now, I am an unconventional energy user. I've got solar water heat on my roof to heat my pool, and that is awesome. All right, it's a no-brainer, all right? I also have a gas-powered generator to heat the pool when it's cloudy. So it's a renewable, so I got gas backup on it. But I tell you what, that is a winner, okay, for heating your pool water. I got solar panels, and I just did this as an experiment. And the reason why I did it as an experiment, the federal credits and the state credits added up to 80% of the cost. All right, so even at 80% carry rate, the payout is 21 years. All right, even with an 80% discount. And I called the guys out who installed it, and I said, dude, come on, I'm not getting anywhere near the kilowatts you told me I get. Oh, well, we did the survey in the winter when there were no leaves on the trees. If you cut down the trees of your house, you get what we promised you. Well, if I cut down the trees, I'm also going to heat my house. That's a loser. So I really support unconventional, or some people call it green energy, where it works on its own merits without any subsidies. But thanks to you taxpayers in the room anyway. So renewable energy, we'll never meet the demand for it because demand is created by advertising. This is my favorite Far Side cartoon, Willie, the birth of advertising. You have a cow, and he is expelling advertising executives. All right? So to survive long term, I think renewables simply need to compete on the open energy market. So in answering the question, can we dominate oil? Can we dominate energy? I think in the oil we can. But the tight oil or the shale oil fracking play, it needs to be real. It needs to be sustained and supported. Natural gas, yeah, short term, I think we can dominate. Long term, we have to resolve that reserves issue. Coal, short term, no, we can't export. But if we can unlock the West Coast ports and enable us to export, we can dominate coal. Nuclear, from a fuel standpoint, probably no. Long term, I think no, from the fuel reserve issues as well as politically. I don't think the Trump administration is going to be able to overcome those political wins. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think we'll be able to dominate in nuclear. Hydro and geothermal, short and long term, no. We just don't have the addition to add additional capacity. And on renewables, I think both the short and the long term, it is no. Nor should we. dominate subsidy energy. We've thrown away trillions on it. It's just not paying off for us. Unless the energy is cost effective, without government subsidies, and it competes on its own merits. So to sum it up, U.S. energy dominance, yes, if we allow all energy to compete on the open markets. It's actually easy if you just let the market do its job.
Question.
Yeah.
You know, last 2 or 3 years, there have been some reports, I think mostly by the environmental wackos, of small Richter, on the Richter scale, 2 to 3 on the Richter scale, earthquaking near the fracking zones in Oklahoma, for example.
Yeah,
What's
going on in Oklahoma is this.
Is this really truthful?
Absolutely, and they should have never done what they did. What they've done in Oklahoma is they're taking the wastewater and they're injecting the wastewater into a geologically unstable area, and they're actually lubricating the earthquake faults. It's not due to fracking, it's a waste disposal issue. And as soon as they had stopped doing that, you've seen the earthquakes come down. The state of Oklahoma should have never allowed waste disposal in that manner.
So that was a real problem in a sense, but they've remedied it.
Yeah, they've stopped.
Okay.
It was not a fracking issue. It was a water injection issue of the wastewater from oil field operations. Okay?
Okay, thank you.